Caseus. The Inner Storm. Chapter 11. For the briefest of moments, they stood. Neither the Jedi nor the Dark Lord making a single move. Caseus felt his rage flow through his veins as he and Dravok slowly split apart and began to circle Vader, who kept his blade up. Then, Caseus lunged forward, striking at Vader's helmet. Vader caught the overhead strike with ease and pushed Caseus back with minimal effort as Dravok moved in, striking at Vader's shoulder. Red and blue blades clashed as Vader sidestepped Dravok and defended against an onslaught from Caseus. Caseus gritted his teeth, remembering how outclassed he was against Skywalker the last time they fought. If he wasn't careful, he would be killed. Vader continued to block strikes against him, coming from every angle before calling upon the Force and sending tables and chairs flying at Caseus and Dravok, who ducked and dodged out of the way. Just as Caseus struck at Vader's arm, he was struck in the ribs and sent flying back by a metal sculpture flung by the Sith Lord. Caseus grimaced and stood back up as Dravok was grabbed by his wrist and flung aside, hitting the wall.
You have deceived yourselves into believing your paltry skills could compare with the power I possess.
Dravok stood and snarled. Your power hasn't impressed me thus far. Dravok and Caseus rushed Vader together, swinging with blinding speed and deft precision. Vader continued to defend as their blades collided, catching both blades in a bind.
I sense your anger. You think yourselves mighty warriors on a righteous crusade.
Vader broke the bind and punched Dravok in his chin before quickly parrying a strike from Caseus and hitting him in the eye with the bottom of his saber hilt.
Your efforts are wasted.
Before Vader could capitalize on his strike, swinging at Caseus, Dravok's blade caught Vader's as Caseus sent out a force push at Vader, sending him back a few feet, giving the Jedi a brief moment of reprieve. Careful, Caseus! Caseus took a Sarisu stance as Vader rushed forward, slamming his blade into the young warriors. Every strike was like trying to defend against an oncoming train. Dravok ran forward, hurling pieces of furniture and broken glass at Vader, who called upon the Force and sent each one flying back at him while continuing to lay into Caseus' defenses. Dravok dodged and flipped around every object thrown his way and brought his blade down, slicing Vader in his shoulder armor as he let out a painful grunt, grabbing Dravok by his tunic and hurling him into Caseus as their skulls collided and sent both of them to the ground. Just as Vader brought his blade down, Caseus used his repulse technique, screaming in anger as Vader was sent off his feet and flying backwards. Dravok helped Caseus to his feet as Vader stood.
You only prolong your demise.
I've suffered more than you could know.
You know nothing of true suffering. But you will.
Caseus and Dravok flew forward once again and continued their assault as Vader once again stood his ground, unfazed by their efforts. Back on the Arabella, Kresh and Tosa were attending to Zaturi, who was having trouble breathing. Suddenly, their ship began to shake as shots from incoming TIE fighters began to blast them. Kresh grunted and snorted angrily at Tosa.
I did destroy them. I don't know how I missed any.
Tosa quickly ran to the gunner's cockpit and began to fire at the incoming fighters. 5 of them. He continued blasting and hit 2 of them. Before the dogfighting could continue, the remaining TIE fighters were blasted away by Rondo's ship.
It took them long enough.
The ship's comm began to beep as Kresh answered.
What's going on in there?
Kresh frantically grunted and groaned.
I don't speak Ithorian, you fool.
Tosa grabbed the comm.
Something went wrong. Harbo and the others are dead. It's just me, Kresh, and the Zabrak.
Where is Caseus?
He and Dravok are still down there with the clone.
We have to get down there then.
Are you nuts? We need to get back to Blengil.
Don't give me that cowardly attitude, Trandoshan. Are you forgetting that you don't get your pay if they die? Tosa snarled and slammed his fist down.
I hate this job. Fine. Then give us cover and we'll do what we can.
The Arabella flew back towards the surface as Rondo followed. Caseus and Dravok pushed their attack harder. Vader was beyond any enemy they had ever fought, but Caseus wouldn't back down, drawing upon his rage even more. He relentlessly flailed against Vader, who was now being pushed backwards towards the shattered windows of the observatory. Before they could continue, Vader backhanded Caseus across his face, knocking him to the floor before grabbing Dravok by his wrist and throwing him out of the window. No! Caseus got up and swung wildly as Vader caught his blade in a circle parry and sent Caseus' saber flying from his hand. Leaping backwards, Caseus dodged Vader's strikes, leaping onto an upper platform.
Your quest for vengeance has doomed you and your allies.
Reaching out with the Force, Vader caused the platform to crumble and collapse as Caseus leapt up, grabbing onto the rafters.
Impressive, but futile.
Vader hurled large pieces of the broken platform at Caseus, who jumped, leaping from rafter to rafter, evading the incoming projectiles before turning his gaze to Vader, who threw his saber spinning towards him. Caseus narrowly moved out of the way as the rafter he held onto was sliced in half, sending Caseus tumbling painfully to the floor. As he sat up, he saw the horrifying form of Vader leaping towards him, saber in hand. Reaching out, Caseus pulled his weapon to his hand and caught Vader's downward strike, his own blade being forced painfully close to his own neck.
Your master failed.
No!
The girl failed.
No!
And now you have failed.
Caseus felt his rage boil past its breaking point as he screamed. Drawing upon every ounce of rage in his heart, Caseus shoved back with his blade in an explosion of fury and sent Vader backwards. Caseus pushed forward, striking with unrivaled power, forcing Vader back on the defensive as he cried out in anger. From behind Vader, a hand gripped the edge of the window as Dravok hoisted himself up and ran at Vader, who turned just in time to be met with Dravok's blade to the side of his arm as Vader cried out in pain. Caseus and Dravok unleashed blow after blow against Vader's blade. Then, Vader unleashed his rage and pressed his own attack, catching Dravok off guard and stabbing through his shoulder. No! As Vader brought his blade down, Caseus caught it and pushed Vader back towards the window. Dravok held his shoulder in pain, staring at Caseus. He was losing himself. Caseus caught Vader's blade in another bind, staring into the dark red eyes of his helmet, of the man he wanted dead.
Yes. Give yourself to the dark side. Feel its power.
Caseus, no! Caseus paid no attention to Dravok and continued to press his blade against Vader's.
Feel your pain. The pain the girl felt when I cut her down.
Caseus lost himself in his anger as the observatory began to shake and rumble. Dravok stared in horror as the entire structure began to collapse. Caseus, stop! Caseus didn't stop. The observatory broke free from the factory and began to tumble downward, as all three combatants were sent free-falling and tumbling along with the observatory before it crashed into the landing platform below, leaving all three in stunned, painful heaps, the pouring rain drenching them. Caseus was dazed and shaking in pain, but he stood, looking at Vader, whose breathing had become labored. Caseus activated his saber and walked over as Vader struggled to stand and slashed down onto the Sith Lord's blade again and again until miraculously, he knocked the weapon from Vader's grip and sliced through Vader's left arm. The Dark Warrior cried out in agony, now on his knees. Caseus' eyes were filled with fury as he stepped closer, staring at his defeated opponent. For my master! Caseus raised his blade. For Sarah! Caseus brought his blade down, slashing across Vader's mask, exposing his burned and mangled skin. Look at me! I want to look into your eyes as you die! Vader looked into Caseus' eyes, his breathing heavy and damaged. Caseus looked back into Skywalker's soulless eyes, and raised his blade again. Caseus, stop! Caseus looked back at Dravok. Caseus, no, not this way. Don't give in. Control it. You're stronger than this.
Do it. Strike me down. Your hate gives you power. Give in.
That's what he wants. Remember why you're doing this. Caseus hesitated before raising his saber. From behind, Dravok saw Vader's lightsaber being lifted into the air through the Force, aiming at Caseus. Just as Caseus brought his blade down, Vader's saber activated and went flying at his back. But it made no contact. Instead, impaling Dravok through his stomach, bringing him to his knees in pain. Dravok! Cassius ran to Dravok and held him as he coughed and sputtered. No, no!
Caseus, it's done. Get out. Run.
Dravok held his comlink in his hand and activated the signal for Juro. Suddenly, Vader's saber flew back into his hand as he stood up. Cassius looked in rage at Vader.
Your hatred has betrayed you, Caseus. You have failed as a student, as a Jedi.
Cassius took a deep breath and stood, hearing footsteps behind as at least 30 stormtroopers arrived and aimed their blasters. Cassius stared back at Vader. It was over. They failed. Suddenly, from above, laser blasts shook the platform as Juro arrived in the shuttle, blasting away at the troopers. Cassius quickly sent out the most powerful force push he could at Vader, sending him flying back as the ramp of the ship opened and Juro stood. Cassius, come on! Cassius ran and leapt towards the ramp, grabbing Juro by his hand, only to stop in midair, feeling himself being pulled back. Turning his head, he saw Vader holding out his hand, gripping Cassius tightly and beginning to reel him back. Cassius was caught in a fierce tug-of-war between Vader and Juro. The rain caused Cassius' grip to loosen as he held on for his life. Cassius, hold on! Vader pulled more and more as Cassius felt his grip loosen. Juro stared at Vader and back to Cassius, before quickly attaching his grapple cable to Cassius and tethering him to the ramp. Juro, what are you doing? Juro looked at Vader and activated the belt of thermal detonators across his chest. Juro, no!
It's been my highest honor, Commander.
For the Republic! No! Juro ran forward and leapt off the ramp towards Vader, who noticed the detonators, letting go of Cassius to stop Juro, grabbing him with the Force just as the detonators exploded with Juro, sending Vader flying backwards. Cassius shut his eyes tightly and ran inside the shuttle, activating all thrusters and blasting off into the sky. Vader slowly stood, his armor damaged, and his suit burned and torn, turning to his troops.
Send your fighters after him.
My lord, our fighters have been destroyed. Any remaining ships we have are already in the air. Vader glared as he heard Dravok coughing in pain, dying from his wounds. Vader walked to him and gripped his throat with the Force.
Tell me where he's going.
Dravok struggled, but suddenly began to laugh.
You don't know. Good. You'll never find him. You won the fight, but not the war. Rot in hell, you bastard.
Dravok laughed directly into Vader's face before his laughing was silenced by a blade through his heart. His eyes dimmed as he was dropped to the floor, rain pouring all around him as he stared off into the distance over the endless sea.
Kakuri.
His breathing stopped, and Dravok was no more. Vader glared at the troopers and back to the sky where the shuttle had been. The officer arrived and saluted Vader. My lord, the Emperor demands an update. Vader's eyes narrowed. His master would not be pleased.
Clean this mess up and call for my ship.
Vader walked away, grabbing Dravok's fallen saber in his hand, before leaving the lifeless corpse where it lay. On board the shuttle, Cassius flew as fast as he could, his emotions running wild. He couldn't dwell on it, as his shuttle was now being pursued by remaining fighters, firing at him. He evaded with the shuttle as it came under heavy fire. His comm suddenly beeped. Need a hand? Rondo's ship flew in with the Arabella as they blasted away at the fighters, destroying them. Head back to Blengiel. All three ships leapt to light speed, and within the hour, they arrived back on Blengiel in the evening hours. Stepping off the shuttle, Cassius collapsed against the wing and sat, staring in absolute silence, as Rondo and the three others ran over.
What happened?
We lost. Zaturi limped over with Kresh, barely conscious.
It was Rax. He sold us out.
Caseus looked up at her and backed down. All this planning, all the training, all the pain, it was all for nothing. They failed. He failed. Failed his master. Failed Dravok. Failed Sarah. Failed Juro. He failed them all. He could have killed him, but he failed. A voice called out in his mind, failure. Failure.
What do we do now?
Caseus stood, completely devoid of emotion, utterly defeated. You go. Live your lives.
What about you?
Just go. Zaturi stepped over to Caseus.
Caseus?
Leave me. Zaturi stared in sadness as she and the others boarded their ships. Rondo took one more look at Caseus before closing the ramp, leaving the traumatized young man alone. Caseus sat for hours in absolute silence. Then he stood, stepping into his shuttle and setting coordinates for Dantooine. Failure was never an option. Now that it was here, he knew it to be true. Vader was right. He failed as a Jedi. He let the dark side take him. And now it was over. It was all over. He was no Jedi. He was nothing. Nothing but a man with nothing to live for. He would never wield the Force again. Days would pass, and Caseus would arrive on Dantooine, landing the ship in a clearing in the forest below, bordering a large swampy marsh. He stood and gathered only what he would need to survive. As he looked at his belt, he noticed a blinking holoprojector. Pulling it out, he activated it. A flickering image of Juro appeared.
Caseus, tomorrow we strike. I know how set you are on seeing this mission through, but I'm recording this to let you know my thoughts. I have no faith in this plan. I can't see any scenario in which we win. But I'm going to see it through, whatever the outcome. That's what soldiers do. They follow their commanders into battle, no matter the odds. Know that if we fail, I followed you to the end. If you're watching this, I didn't make it. If you can see this message, run. Go away somewhere, and stay hidden. Another opportunity will come, but you have to survive. It's the only way for the Jedi to live on. Juro signing off. May the Force be with you, Caseus.
The hologram ended as Caseus closed his eyes, grabbing his belongings and stepping out of the ship. Looking at the shuttle, he knew this would be the last thing he ever did with the Force. Lifting it into the air, he moved it over the swamp and dropped it in, letting it submerge into the waters. Looking ahead, carrying everything he owned on his back, he started walking into a new life, a life of solitude.